I think we got a little more than an hour here, around an hour to roll through this. There's an awful lot of data. There's some new things we've added that I want to try to hit a little bit with you. I really want to start off, this is called the Cost Production Benchmarking Standard. That's a term we've called it for a long time. Ken Mogler, if you participated in the FBS meeting and you were here yesterday morning for the legal talk, Ken, who comes out of the manufacturing section of the U.S. industry, of General Mills and some other operations, it really presented some interesting thoughts about basically how's the industry works and some of this information and how it might pertain to agriculture and the farm world. So I'm going to change this, I think, next year to key performance indicators instead of cost of production, right? KPIs. That's the industry term, key performance indicators. And because it really drove home to me yesterday, listening to him, that what is this? This is not just your cost of production. It is. But it's set up in a way that it becomes a performance indicator that you can compare with other operations. So what we're really trying to do here this afternoon is talk about what we're seeing really from a competitive standpoint. A lot of people think, well, benchmarking doesn't apply to me. Yeah, you can benchmark against yourself. But really what we're doing here is trying to pick it up a notch and say, how do you compare to the industry that you're in? Are you, where do you have opportunities? Where do you have challenges? So this is the 13th year we've done this. We have a few people in the room. Jim Reeve in the back. Mitch Richmond up here. Bob Kogemeyer. Bob, raise your hand. Mitch up in the front. Jim, raise your hand. These are all accountants at LattHarris, and they all had hands in this process, plus there's a whole bunch of other accountants that have their hands. And here's our pork industry, an actual crop team. We see we have a number. We have about 75 or 80 employees, depending on time of the year, at LattHarris. We probably have, I've been asked this a lot, we probably have approximately 12, maybe at times 15, 10 to 12 accountants that are in FBS with client data almost every single day. So FBS and our client base are pretty well linked together. So we have a lot of knowledge about it. We've been doing this comparative cost of production stuff, KPIs, that we've been producing here for 13 years on the hog side, and now into the 4th and 5th year on the crop side, is really helping us do a lot of things that we haven't been able to do before. We can consult much better with clients. We can help them get their data into a format that this works. So as part of that, we've been getting larger. We've been growing. We've been adding new. You see the 8. Well, Jim, JR is a little bit older, but he's younger than me. Mitch and Bob here. We got the next generation, a younger generation that we're bringing in and trying to get trained up because we really see the future of American agriculture and production agriculture, be it in hogs or crops or anything basically in the Midwest. So that's our ever-developing team. We're actually constantly looking for new people who join us on that. So we're in the hiring mode. Okay, what is this? This is some of this you heard from the crop side. This is a confidential peer group. Nobody really knows. There's people in this room that participate in this data study, but nobody really knows who they are. Nobody knows who anybody else's numbers are except themselves. It's not a contest. Because of that, there's no bragging rights. You can go back home and say we did well comparatively, but nobody else outside of your own operations know what you're doing. It's not a yield score. It's a yield contest. It's published. This is totally private information. This is managerial information. This is designed, and its purpose is to help you and your operations as managers make better decisions. And that's its goal. We use FBS in many cases, not exclusively, but almost a lot of the cases because it's a good, solid way to collect the information that we need to put into this format. It's not actually, as managerial accounting, it's not absolutely perfect. we make some assumptions, we do a little rounding and something, but we think we're trying to get to that 95th percent kind of confidence that these numbers mean something. But everything doesn't always tie out exactly perfectly, but we don't think you need that to make better decisions. So what do you need to participate if you're not currently participating? You need accrual level financial statements, which, they don't always have to be perfectly accrual prepared by an accountant, but they need to be prepared from a generally kind of accepted process, meaning you got to account for prepaids, you got to have a cutoff date where you know whether that activity, you've got pig sales here that just occurred in the period you're looking at, or if there's some sales coming from another period. You got to be able to control that. But most of that is not with some support. And we provide that, and FBS is now doing some stuff with the control. What do you call your controller?
Virtual controller.
Virtual controller. So there's starting to be more and more places that you can seek some help with that. On that end, I'm just going to mention, because I know we have some people from Southeast Iowa here, mostly not talking to this group too much, but Hills Bank, which is the Hills Bank in Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, is a very large, regional, very aggressive ag, does a lot of stuff in ag. They have come to us, and we are in the process of putting together a series of classes on trying to help people get a better understanding of accrual and managerial information. So that may be starting as early as next winter, 17. And hopefully maybe we can build off of that. We have participants from a number of states in this database. I got to move up here to speed up. So we go through the process, this thing that we've done for 13 years. We got to make a rough estimate based on prior year's information. We look at the feed activity. We kind of define some initial benchmarks. And then we start working with our actual client data, or people that are sending data into us. We look at it, we try to get it into what we call it normalized fashion, so it's comparable, relatively comparable between farms. We do a number of processes. I'm not going to go into an awful lot of that today, but we do it for the pork industry. We do it on 3 stages of production. We do it at a degree to wean. What's it cost me to produce a wean pig? Okay. So if you had one entity and all it did was wean pigs, and it had sows and so forth, you roll up all those costs and divide it by the number of wean pigs you sold. And that would be a wean pig cost. We have a wean to finish cost production, which is the cost to add 100 pounds of gain. So that doesn't include the cost of the pig. That includes those costs once that pig arrived in that wean to finish barn or wean to finish operation. Or if you're a nursery finish, if you're combining the 2 steps in what's it cost to add 100 pounds of gain, to take that from a 13-pound pig to a 287-pound pig, whatever your market rate. So that's the wean to finish cost per 100 pounds of gain. We're talking about that. And then we do a whole herd cost of production, which is combining basically what's it cost to produce a wean pig and what's it cost to do the wean to finish. And I will show you how those are additive, and then we get to a whole herd cost of production. Now, in some cases, some of the participants, all we have is whole herd data. We don't have the stage of growth data, but if we do, we have presented those. If you are a participant and we have all 3 stages, you will have identities that tell you which one or which stage you're in. So this is that's why we gave you a printout. Lots of the text is really small on the screen. Don't have any expectation that you can read it. But this is those 3 stages of growth: wean, finish, whole herd. So if you're, and these are the benchmarks. So these are the benchmarks. We kind of stick our heads out a little bit. We look at what we think what the activity should be. We look at what we actually observe. Now this, I want to also repeat, this is not scientific study. This isn't a university study. We don't go out and make survey to make sure we have a really beautiful distribution of operations here. This is observational data that we think is really good data, for the most part. Actually, I feel 95% confident in most of the data, almost all the data that comes into us, and I try to exclude the stuff that I don't feel fits. So we observe data, and we observe what we think should be, and we start to think about it. I have some models that I build that kind of projects where the benchmark should be, and we kind of interact with that, and we stick our neck out and we say, okay, if it's 90% benchmark in this year, and that's whatever that stage of growth is, if you're at that 90% number, we think you're in the top 10% of the industry. Okay? And if we say, and if you look at your numbers, you're closer to the 50th, what we call the 50th is kind of the average of the industry. Now, we don't know if it's an exact average of the industry, but the way we define the 50th is if you're not doing better, 50th or better, on an ongoing basis, you're probably not going to stay in the industry. Just think about that. If you're always below average in a highly competitive industry, you're likely not to be there very long unless you got money coming in from someplace else. It's not going to sustain itself. So if you're now, what you'll see here as we go to the end, and I want to make sure I have time to do this. When we start to look at multi-years, it becomes obvious that everybody has bad years. You have a disease problem or something going on in your operation, you may slip down. But on average, the herds that perform well tend to come back up. So if you had a bad year this year and you lost a little ground, you probably can explain it. If you consistently, year after year, find yourself towards that bottom end of that range, you need to start thinking about, am I a real player in this industry or not? I'm not telling you should get out or anything, but I think you should be asking yourself before you invest a lot more money in that enterprise, am I a serious player? So that's, again, that whole idea is, what good is this stuff if you can't make decisions? If we don't stick our neck out and define the 50th and 90th, we're not doing you any service. If you don't know, okay, I'm a number, what does it mean? You know, if you're in the 90th, consistently in the 90th, and we've done this for people, is you ought to think about doing more of this. If you're in the 50th, you have said to people, maybe you ought to raise pigs for somebody else. You know, maybe raising them yourself's not going to work. So anyway, I'm just going to skip this quick, but this shows, and I'll show these on various ones when I get to the lean finish, I'll really identify this. This is what we actually observed with the benchmarks. Our goal is to make the kind of the observations come out in the middle. Okay. This is that kind of roll up that you can kind of look at. So that's where we take the cost of the lean pig, a 90th percentile, you divide it by 1 minus the death loss, because you have to get it, you have to equate it to a pig that you actually sold. So it's $34 for the lean pig cost. There was a $36.50 cost per hundred. There's 2.67 hundredweights of gain. So 97.45. You add those two together, it's 131.59. You divide that by hundredweights sold, and you translate that back into the whole herd number. So each of the numbers, as they look on that page, you say, what's the relationship? This slide tells you what that relationship is. And it's actually a mathematical relationship. This slide is kind of the big picture, kind of looking at the change between the red bar is the 50th. These, of course, are our benchmarks since 2008. The blue bar is the 90th. And I started to do this because I say to myself, is the industry getting mature? If you read business books, they always talk about mature industries. Mature industries, when kind of everybody's kind of got it figured out, and it really becomes very commodity-like. We're a commodity industry to begin with, but how mature is our industry? And therefore, the early years, back in 2010, 2011, you see at the bottom the variance spread. 2010, it was only $7.3 between the 50th and 90th. But then look what happened over 11, $12, $9, $11, $14 in 2014, down a little bit to 11. This industry still has a lot of variation. Now, a lot of people who know Warren Buffett, I would think we look at industries and say, oh, there's variation here, so there's opportunity. If you can do it better than anybody else, you can make a lot of money. There's a variation in this industry. And I think that's what this is on. There's a lot of variation in this industry. And some people make an awful lot of money out of this industry, and some people struggle. And partially it's that due to that variation. So in 2000, Mark and I were going through Pentagon, and I was going through these numbers the other day, and our expectation is that all costs should be down because feed is down in 15 from where it was in 14. And Mark said, well, how come our 15 breeding weans are now down there actually slightly up? And that's because I take real data and go back and look at my model. I actually had to adjust the model from 15 on the breed to weans because something was going on that hadn't been going on earlier, and it had something to do with the way sows were being fed. So I don't know. I'm not a production expert. I don't know if as an average we went from 21 pigs per sow per year, a decade, 22, a decade ago, to 28, 29, that we're feeding the sows differently than we had to. So I had to adjust the model basically to match what I was really seeing in the wean to finish. And so this is kind of, on the breed to weans, this is a bit of an adjustment here. So that's why that benchmark actually went up in 15. You see a pretty substantial drop in the wean to finish, and that's driven by feed costs. The sow unit, I'll come back to this too. The breed to weans, feed went down some, but because of the adjustment, it didn't go down as much as you might expect. The big change in the breed to weans is the genetics cost, and my observation is that was driven by the value of cull sows. So to get back to your discussion, and you had a very interesting point, which I never articulated this way before, is about waste, about managing. In the manufacturing industry, they talk about, you want to reduce the amount of waste you have in the process. And, we don't use that term very often. We know death loss is a waste usually. We know that crappy feed efficiency is a waste. But, we usually don't use it very much. But I began to realize that really what our cost production numbers are telling us is the waste that's existing. When you're at 52 percentile instead of 78 percentile, that difference between those cost numbers is in a sense a measurement of the form of waste of what you're doing versus what you could be doing. And that's why I think calling this a key performance indicator is pretty valuable. Back on the breed to weans. So anyway, on the breed to weans, genetics went up because the cost when you culled your sows, and you'll see the numbers from where they were a year before and the year before that, they were worth a lot more than they were last year. And they're a cost reducer to your genetics cost because you're basically selling the cull sows off as a revenue stream. And I've been starting to see this over and over again, either in the crop side, using custom farming, or using your equipment more efficiently. And in the pork side is, what are you getting for every little piece that you're dealing with? Cull sows are not something to be disposed of, they're something to be marketed. And that was my takeaway from this. So this is that process. I'll go through that a little more as we go. This is kind of just a summarization. 20 farms in the breed to wean, 80,000 sows, about 2 million pigs, 2.03 million pigs, averaging 25, 23 pigs per sow per year in this group, in this observation. The range is pretty considerable. And that was back to that whole benchmark range idea. There's a lot of variation that exists out there. And then you see here, I'm not going to go through each one, but you see in genetics there's a range, in feed there's a range. You think everybody feeds everything the same, but they don't. Somehow it doesn't definitely. Veterinarian was the one cost category I have the most trouble with, especially between stages of growth, because some stuff gets done at the solid, some stuff gets done at the lean finish, and I'm wrestling with a way to try to do that better. So it's not consistently applied, and I think that's what I would see. There's a big range in the lean finish. Excuse me, please. So here's some reports. Here's some reports that Mitch actually had pulled out of the data set. Less than 3,000 sows, greater than 3,000 sows. We used 3,000 sows because that was kind of the midpoint in the data set. Again, trying to obscure who any individual would be. You can see that the larger units had a little lower cost, but not a huge difference in cost, which is actually pretty consistent with what we have seen on a scale basis. And there is one exception to that, which I'll bring up here towards the end. But a lot of things, especially year in and year out, not seeing huge variances based on scale. That just because you're large, you're not necessarily lower cost. Here, actually, the 3,000 sow units, in the average of the study, their pig cost was 91 cents less per pig, so less than a dollar. And in the prior year, the smaller units were 68 cents lower. So they flip-flopped between the 2 years, and we've seen that over and over again. So my sense is you almost have to say there's not a particular difference. Size alone does not become the prices. And here it is on a per sow basis. Again, just the data there for you to look at, study later. Here's the actual report. So the green is what we define as the 90th percentile, or the top 10%. The red is the 50th percentile. The kind of the average in the middle is the average of the participants, 3668. Now you look up there at the green or below, cost lower than the green. And you look over the far left, you see sow herd size. 2 of those are less than 3,000, 2 of them are greater than 3,000. And then you start looking, and let's talk just a little bit about how we segment out the costs. We have personnel costs, that's what's defined as labor, workman's comp, insurance, benefits, that's all in that labor category, divided by number of pigs weaned. That's the personnel category. And then we have facilities, which is depreciation, book depreciation, or something that we can approximate on the facilities. That is property taxes if you own your own facilities, that's repairs, that's all in that facilities kind. If you contract produce and you're just paying a contract payment, we actually do an adjustment to kind of break that contract payment into facilities and labor and other. Others kind of a catch-all for anything to do with facilities. Sometimes it includes some weather activity. Sometimes it includes some vehicles. So it's just kind of something that doesn't quite fit in the other places in the other. And that comes up with what we call cost normally one by contract. That's a benchmarkable number. You can go hire somebody to do those services to raise your pigs for you. Lots of you in this room do that. So that's a benchmarkable point. While personnel may not be benchmarkable, but the total of the three together is then we look at genetics costs, we look at feed, we look at debt, we do a subtotal before we look at G&A and interest, just to show you the break. in this case, be sorted by total cost, which is over there on the front of that. The little kind of orange lines are kind of a sense that, that to me, what that's kind of, what I'm using that for is kind of saying, okay, those numbers that are actually between the average of the first half standard deviation are probably, probability-wise, not significantly different. You're just trying to say, don't make a big deal about the fact that you're a few cents cheaper than the next guy. If you're starting to be 25, 50 cents, $1, or $2 cheaper or higher, those are more real numbers to base yourself on. Any questions? So what did we see in the grid? Because I'm on that read there, I really got moved. Feed is down. Facilities fairly steady. Genetics, look at how genetics jumped up in cost. Then I break out labor again and other, but med fairly up just a little bit, but pretty much stable. So really the big change there was feed and genetics. So sow cells, call sow cells. Repeating this again. Average pound sold, 481 pounds, up a little bit, up 13 pounds from the prior year. But look at the range, 380 to 533. You would think most people would cull sows at about the same range. So everybody's not treating cull sows the same. Some people are pulling them off the sows and taking them to market. Well, it must be damn near the next day, or the same day. And some people are feeding them out a little bit for a while and put some weight on them and let them get rid of their milk weight, whatever. But look at them with the value, average value of 37. Look at what it was in 2014, $70. Look at that huge, humongous drop in value of the sows between the 2 years. And that went from $330 a head to $180. And that's a number, the way we do the calculation, about right back to genetics costs. And that was a big raise in genetics costs. Because we had people in prior years that were salvaging their cull sows so well, they were actually ending up with 0 to negative genetics costs. They were getting enough money out of their cull sows to pay most of their costs. Big range. It's been worse than it was in $15, $22 last year. Actually, when times are better, people get my pejorative term there. When things are good, people don't concentrate as much. When things are higher, people do a better job of marketing and so forth. But it went from $148 swing in 14 to a $42 swing. But it's 88 to 13, 101 and 12, $54 back and all that. So, to me, it's something that somebody's got. We should see that number constantly be working its way down and we see it bouncing around. So I'm thinking it's something that whoever's managing those units, making those decisions about sow cells, could make some money by dropping their genetics costs about $2 a head. $2 a head, 28 pigs per litter. It starts to turn into real money. I know some people probably don't have systems that they can do that, but that's back to that systems thing. If it's important, figure out how to make your system enable it. So now we're moving into wean to finish. Again, I'm going along here a little bit, which I need to. So a little over half a million pounds produced, 500,000 pounds produced. Approximately, divide that kind of by the average sale rate, approximately a little over 2 million pigs, which in the U.S., what are we producing now? Who knows? 120, 115, what's the total U.S. production? Over 100 million now. $40. That I should know. I'm thinking it's 1 to 2% of the U.S. production. So, and if you look at our data set too, we have units in here of pretty much quite a diverse scale. We have some relatively really small units. I mean, 300,000, I think, is a pretty small unit in today's world. We don't have anybody in this data study that's in the top, the big commercials. But that tier below that, we have a number of participants. So we got, what really we have in this study are family farms. And they vary considerably in size, but they're family operations. So we're still seeing lots of wild swings there. But the 8 herds under $38, under the average, 2 of those 8 produce more than 100,000 hundredweights. So the larger in the industry, at least in our study. But 6 produce less. Again, nothing jumping out there saying, well, just because you're large, you're going to be better. You know, that's just not showing up in our data, and year in, year out, it does not show up in our data. That being large is any guarantee of success. So here we're looking at 2015 average less than 100,000 hundredweight, 3796. Greater than 100,000 hundredweight, 3960. So, and that has gone the other way in the past. Mitch, do we have a slide in there? It says total cost per hundredweight. Okay, and here's the data set here on the screen. 2,053,000 pigs. You notice there is no genetics cost because the cost of genetics is in the pig size, in the lean pig, it's not in the lean fish. This is the cost to add 100 pounds of gain. Again, the same kind of layout on contractor costs, the same kind of layout on an average of 90th and 50th. One thing that I often do when I check in the 90th and the 50th is I look to be sure that I actually observe, if I see 90th costs, 90th percentile costs, am I seeing anybody actually achieving these kind of numbers? I don't feel comfortable saying that the 90th is nobody can get to it. Well, we always make sure we can find people that can achieve them. And sometimes it's not that they achieve them on every single category, but somebody has achieved them in a given category. And so if you summarize that, you get to some cases a hypothetical number. But most of the time, we're seeing people that are able to achieve those type numbers. The same thing on the 50th. Now, the nice thing about our data set, many of the clients that are in here, and everybody that's in here is not a full-time client of ours, but a number of them are. We know a lot about them. And when we start to see trends in history, we know who's buying farms. We know who's struggling with the bank. So that's us. I can't go into details about anything specific on that, but that is part of what we go through to figure out where these benchmarks are, because we proof it against reality. We are able to say, you know, that makes sense with what we're seeing in that operation. So in the wean to finish, the big driver on that was, you see kind of an orange bar, and the blue bar is kind of a pretty substantial drop in feed cost. The other cost that kind of is creeping up a little bit over 5 years is facilities. I'm not sure why that is, but that's what was reported to us. I don't know if contracts came up again and things are a little higher, or new facilities are being built. I know they're more expensive than things that have been out there. Saw very little change in that man, and G&A and interest is pretty material. But this is where I'm going to talk a little more about where I lay out our benchmarks compared to what we observed. You can see here in 2015, the orange and the green awfully close together. That makes me a little bit uncomfortable with my 90th percentile. That it should probably even be better, lower cost than what we have defined it. I'm seeing an awful lot of observed units getting awfully close to that 90th. So my 90th number, at the end of the day, I come back and I do this and I kind of see does it make sense. And if I had to tweak it a little more, I'd say if you look at the 90th range, but there's some birds down towards the bottom end of that, which are somewhat lower than others. But the bottom is just, again, the spread over time. Don't read too much into this, but of the benchmarks this year, that's the one I'm not least certain about. This slide talks about how we deal with some of those things to normalize the data, how we deal with inventory change. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now, but if you're a participant, you may hear discussions about how we actually do the process. Or if you're new to us next year, which I hope you are, and if we're currently not including you, then we can work with you to get your data into this format. Now we're moving into breed to finish. The whole herd numbers, 14 farms, 5165. Spread. Look at that spread. $30 a pig. $30 a pig in the range of data we saw. Back to that statement I made about this is not a mature industry. There are still opportunities, and there are still people in this industry that struggle, and there are people in this industry that do extremely well. And there is still a lot of waste going on in the industry. And it could be, some of it will never get captured because we're raising organic animals, we're raising animals. They don't perform like widgets. We don't completely control it. We deal with death loss and disease pressures and new diseases and all kinds of things and weather. And, there's a lot of stuff you guys have to deal with every day. And what I don't have any idea is that what we have to live with, a $30 spread, or are we able to do better? My expectation is we're able to do better. And there's the spread in the other. Down at the bottom, again, it's a size issue. Other 10 herds under 5165. 6 were large, sold 8 million pounds, and 4 sold less than 8 million pounds. So in this case, the larger units were slightly more representative. And you see that in the kind of the whole herd numbers. Now, to be fair to the data set isn't identical at each stage of growth because we have people that have breed weans, but they don't finish. All they do is sell pigs, piglets, SEW pigs. So they don't do whole herd. They may sell them. Actually, we have participants in this room that take those pigs out of the sow unit and then finish them on their own farms. But we don't have the lean to finish data from those individual farms to kind of see what does that look like on a whole herd. I'm not sure if the mean because it's sort of different people's farms anyway. So the data sets aren't perfectly matched. So you're going to come up with slightly variation. But look at the larger units were a couple dollars, almost a couple dollars a hundredweight lower cost than the small units. Smaller units, 8 million pounds is the cutoff. So if you were 7 million, you're under less than 8 million. 9 million, you're greater than that. So it's not a huge swing between some of those. But there are some pretty good swings in there. So in 15 data set, $1.64, 58 cents per pig, 58 cents per hundredweight. Anyway, and we're going almost identical each. So whole herd feed drop, look at genetics, it's such a small bar at the bottom relative to feed, but slightly up. Facilities about the same, net about the same. So feed and genetics. And this is stacking ourselves up against the benchmarks and the data come out. So I guess I would say I feel like the process worked pretty well for the whole benchmarks. Of course, this is another side of it. I've added this a few years ago to start looking at, because the cost side is only part of the issue. The revenue is the other side of that. And these are just observations on revenue. This is, again, not scientific. These are just stuff we're seeing in the data set. The average market weight, 283, up a little bit. Lower feed, you'd expect that this. I think I would expect it to go up with lower feed costs. Average value on the market side, 56.40, down a lot. Of course, this is why people in Reddit now, in 15, some of the people in 15 made some money, some people lost some money in 15. Average value per head, that's pretty shocking. Down $60 from 14. So it's $60 right off the top, not available. Nothing you guys did, something the market presented to you. Off values, the off values I see kind of like coincide. It's kind of maybe an opportunity to do a better job in marketing off value homes. Those weights are up a little bit. The value is down $32 than were a year ago, so your off value have your contribution for those pigs that don't fit the box or don't fit the measures you're going to are really not contributing much. Percentage of off value, which I was glad to see, slightly down on what was reported. That's really having two, if you're FBS, two ledger accounts, so you've got market hours and you've got off values. And you track them, and it's easy to track. And if you go back to a dashboard or you're doing some kind of internal control, it's nice to be able to measure how good are we doing sorting animals, or we got too many animals out there in the barns that should have maybe been either treated differently or maybe eliminated before they ever got to the marketplace. But a little bit better, but look at the range, 1.2 to 4.6. So here we're getting some of this range, which is not positive. Why is somebody dealing with that much off-value animals? Because it's all kind of affects the bottom line. Observations on profit margin. Average net revenue is 160. Not a huge range, but still $26 on average. Between the observations and the value per head. Better than 14 and $37. Market range is still more than I would expect. Sometimes when we get into the data, we look at the data and say, why are you selling Jesus? You could sell 300. Why are you selling 270s? Is there something in that flow? You have to push pigs out the barn faster because you don't have space or whatever. You have them sell them a little bit light. Ken talked about this yesterday. I'm going to try to write back this again a couple of times. Is all this stuff about separating yourself from the 90th and the 50th. It's not that there's one big smoking gun someplace that's causing all your problems. It's a cumulative bite off of a number of bits of waste that accumulate into enough waste that it actually starts to drag you down. And as the account values, as in off-out values, maybe potentially marketing weights, are you selling in the right place on the box to get your maximum dollars? It's really hard for me to judge because everybody's got a little different mechanism, but I see enough of it. There's got to be something going on. Now, there's a new unit going in Michigan that's got some ownership by some producers. There's the Triumph system that's in that's been in for a number of years, that's got some ownership by producers. And believe me, I was involved in trying to set up some stuff owned by producers early on that was a total disaster. But some of these large-scale processes going in look pretty promising for these operations to be able to start to put a little more window on the marketplace. The other thing that we've seen over the years are people that do specialties, they do genetics, they do yelks, they're finding, just like the crop operations that are doing specialty grains or doing something for a targeted market, the same kind of thing exists in the hogs. I keep hearing about new ones. I hope they work great. And, but a lot of times, if anything you can find that gives you a little edge, gets you a couple extra dollars to the bottom line, worthy of consideration, if it's crops or hogs. Because we have seen that over and over again where that actually pans out. Sometimes it pans out pretty well. Yeah, sometimes it's a total disaster. I don't know that, but I haven't seen the total disaster recently. More than a decade ago. But maybe kind of burned some people about considering that stuff today. So now we're kind of getting into, I'm trying to wrap up here a little bit, kind of getting into where we estimate. So, what is the cost production on average going to be for this year that we're in right now? So this is the first step of next year's report, which I kind of went in right now and I looked at. We track basically weekly grain costs. What's reported in Southeast Iowa, and these are all based on Southeast Iowa to some extent. So if your basis is substantially different, you need to think about that in your adjustment. But we look at the costs that are out there. We look at the costs we had last year with the whole philosophy that your best predictor of your costs for next year will probably be costs for last year, which is maybe a stretch, but it's a place to start. You look at where feed is at through July, and that's what we're coming up with numbers. So this is first draft, first guess for what this year is going to be like. Now, if you were, I know a few in this room are probably pretty close to being able to do this, is drop your current numbers to the end of the year and in July compare this and say, okay, this was John's got a hypothetical benchmark. How are we doing? And this is kind of a budget at this point. So that's how this might be used. This is also what troubles me a lot when I read the reports about shackle space this winter, the number of pigs that are coming to market, and the stresses that are going to be on. Yeah, everybody in here has got a different situation, but I looked at it could be a lot of red ink coming up for a while. So I hope I'm wrong. But until those new plants get built, I'm a little worried. And what's the closest one? Year one?
Next fall, yeah.
A year this fall?
Yeah, September or October.
Of 17. Yeah. So they're a year out. Lots of people, we hear an awful lot of new production going in, new sow units. Hopefully not as much as we hear about, because it's been staggering. What we've heard about. So, if that all comes to fruition and those units are getting built this summer, there's going to be a gap. There's going to be a period here where there's going to be a lot more pigs than there's at home. So, and I don't know where you're at politically, but TPP, getting that thing passed through Congress, Obama's fit for it, fortunately, but Hillary's against it, and Trump's against it, and it's a big political volleyball moment. But God, I think that would be a big advantage to you guys. All of you is to get access to information. So I don't know. That could change everything. In fact, it's there, but stay politically active in your association. I'm a past president of the National Pork Producers, so weigh in, do what you can to help. This stuff matters. So, green to wean 6-year average. So, since the beauty of the system, we've been doing this long enough, and some of you have been doing it long enough with us that we're able to keep multiple years worth of data. And big data, like we were talking about yesterday in data management, I got a big pivot table, and I go in and I look at averages on 6 years. Now, everybody doesn't qualify because not everybody participates for 6 years. And that's why I really try to encourage everybody, even if you have a bad year, go ahead and get the data in, because it really helps us look at a long-term average. So these are 6-year averages. Now the green and the red are, and actually the gray, the average, is the average of the observations each year. Wow. So they're more, while the individual lines are their own individual averages. So I probably shouldn't even include the benchmarks, because I think they probably don't, because they've got a lot more data. The benchmarks have a lot more data. They got the full range of data. While the individuals has just got your own data. So I'm finding it pretty interesting, and this is where I'm saying that if you are one of those units and you're got 3981, 3918, 3892, and you're competing with people at 3349, 3422, 3440 over a 6-year time frame, this is a key performance indicator to me that says, how competitive are you? You see what you got to compete against. Who's going to be here at every time? Don't know. And there may be good reasons you're down there. And it may be totally okay. You may still be made. Some of those guys that are down to it have still made money over that time. But what I would think when I go to the question, should I invest? What's the cost to a new $3,000 unit now? 12 million, 18 million? What's it?
That's if you, I think if you filter it, the number for it's $2,500 a solid.
$2,500 a solid to build a new unit. Now, if depending on where I was on this chart, how my excitement about building a new solid unit would vary quite a bit. That's how I would look at it. Prove me wrong. We need to finish 5-year averages. Same kind of idea. And I have seen people that are really good on the green to weeds that are not so great on the weed to finish. Maybe they ought to raise SEWs for somebody else. They're really good at doing that. Maybe they're not the best for whatever reason, location, whatever, and doing it for the market side. And this one I actually find pretty interesting. I'm not exactly sure what I was telling you, but look how narrow the variance is over 6 years. It's not a very big range. So what tells me, and also I've seen this over and over again, is everybody has a bad year. You know? Every year you're not in the 90th percentile. Every year you're not sitting at the 50th percentile. You know, you have PERS. You have PERS on top of PERS. You know, you have whatever. You got something going on. But they are grouped 6 herds here. Over time, they come back. Or they don't. If they come back, and we've seen that over and over again, where if you look at your data this year and say, well, gee, we didn't do well, and you understand why you didn't do well, you understand what you got to do better next year, and it's achievable, that's one thing. If you look at why you did bad this year, and you did bad the year before, the year before that, then you've got to ask yourself, what's inherently wrong? Back to that whole flow. What's good with our system? What can we do? And where's our position in that? So that's where that goes. This actually is a report we do for a couple of them, guys that are only raised for somebody else. So that's giving them a benchmark on their contracting costs. And I think I'm how am I doing time? Oh, 5 minutes. So next week, next Tuesday, Carthage, Joe Martin, Carthage Vet has asked us, Mark and I, to come speak to they have their big down at Monmouth, 500 some producers, and they have breakout sessions and so forth, and we're doing the session. And they asked us to talk about the benchmarks and profit potential. And again, back to that whole discussion of it isn't one thing, it's a cumulative effect of lots of different things. Mark and I sat down and tried to come up with some things to talk about here on kind of like what's the impact of some changes. And that's what I'm just going to run through here really quickly. Between the 50s and what we're seeing, and actually, the Carthage asked us to do this 10 years ago, so we're updating the presentation in 10 years. In 2005, it was different from what we were seeing during the average in the 90th, was about $685,000. In 2015, that's $1.3 million. That's all in variance between being average and being in the 90th. On a 2400 South Beach finish, marketing on those things. A lot of money. We've got a lot more money. It's probably investing a lot more money than we did in 2005 in aggregate. We've got a lot more at stake. Lots of our costs have gone up. We still see these things. Markets, do some discount and they get together. The impact of 24, you can do the math and translate it to whatever size salary you're doing with. $82,000 for 2,400 salary year on getting one more pay per salary year. These are fairly simplistic looks, but trying to get a sense of what's going on. You get, if your facilities, you're pushing more pigs through that. That's right, over $50,000 in income. You having a bigger advisor, you're growing the overall costs. We finished $132,000. But Mark and I kind of went back and actually looked at this sort of data. We've seen a huge increase in pigs per sow per year over the last decade. Big increase. Not really seen on pig efficiency. Not seeing the number, and we discussed this, and when we're raising bigger pigs, we're losing pigs. And bigger pigs they're not as efficient. So we're wondering we'd like the university or somebody to give us some blueprint or not. But we really haven't seen the big improvements in food efficiency. Food efficiency translates into lots of money. And I think, again, you guys have to reset when you go from selling pigs for $70 or $80 to selling them for $40 or $50 or $30 a hundred. You have to reset how you feed them, what you're going for, what's the important efficiency, what's the component of the diet. We talked a little bit about it yesterday with crop inputs, when Mo was here, and the fact that there's still a much bigger range in crop inputs. Again, we're not being, somebody said yesterday, well, you're not being sponsored. Well, we were talking about machinery costs, and so, well, you must not be sponsored by John Deere, because we were kind of critical of machinery costs. Well, we're not being sponsored by any feed companies either. And we have actually started to see feed operations who you would have thought would have been way beyond this a while ago, realize that their feed company they have been working with, the deals they have been getting, was costing them money. And I have never seen a time when a feed company has cost somebody money because they sold them crap. I'm sure it's happened, but I've never seen it. It's always they sell you when you need. You're always overfeeding. Just like when we talked about inputs yesterday. Maybe you're buying more chemicals than you need. Maybe you're buying more stacked genes than you need. Maybe, you can't translate that into revenue. And you're paying for something you waste. You're paying for waste. You're buying something you don't need. That's a waste, isn't it? And so I think that's happening in feed again. So I would challenge you as you go into this crunch time, or actually we're in the crunch time, look at your feet hard again. And we had one we had preached to over and over. You know, have somebody impartial give you feet advice. Somebody that isn't selling you anything. Where do they get feet advice from? The person that was selling you something. And they finally realized, you know, we could save quite a bit of money. So, you think it was done? You think we all learned that lesson? But it's coming back. But I would challenge you that, you know, look hard at this. Look hard that it's the right mix of ingredients and right mix of drug meds, right mix of ration formulation to meet the reality of the record. Easy to say. Easy for me to say. You know, we're wrestling about whether you need to own your own bill or not. We see over and over again that it looks to be, but I know of instances of people don't own their bill and they do just fine. So I'm not as strong on that as Mark is. You know, watch those sell weights, watch those boxes, watch that revenue side. I see, and I only say this because I helped negotiate the original price reporting bill with the factors, which expired, but it's starting back up again. That everybody's got now it's mandatory, everybody's got to report the deals. So, man, we have been starting to see some people that have a little better deals on. Maybe that's okay, but if you're selling pigs, it's nice to have to know if it's not level, how is it not level? But there are deals out there. I think the large food companies are not beyond picking winners and losers. And, you know, we've seen that over and over again, and I think it still is. So I think I'm going to wrap up. I'm done. So anyway, hope that was somewhat useful. Again, I thank Kent for helping me get some insight. Any questions? Go ahead. We'll be around. Our accountants are here. Call us if you're interested in doing something. Thank you.